So that's the pond liner in loosely. We're not being too concerned or careful about the creases and the folds on the majority of the pond liner, and really just focusing on the base of the pond for the time being, making sure that that is flat and level and crease free. We can start to feel now a bit of water in the deeper section of the pond, and the weight of the water is going to start to pull the liner down into its correct position, and then I can start to fold neatly the creases that are going to become obviously evident as the liner starts to fill the void. Oh, it's quite nice this. Here we go. We have a pond. So that's filled right up. There's hardly any water left in the reservoir, so that was a really good guess in the quantity. So I'm going to give this, excuse the lawnmower, a cursory trim just to get rid of the bulk of the excess, but still leaving a good 30 centimetres of overlap all around the outside of the pond. And then we can start to think about building the pond and putting some stone in. A lot of rock to clean before we can put it in the water. You can already see this milkiness that's come off of this stone. And it's really important, not just for discoloration in the water, but most importantly to make sure that the adhesive, either the mortar, cement, or the foam that you're using, is going to be able to bond properly onto the rock. So the rock needs to be clean, dry, and sort of dust-free for that to be able to work properly. Oh, it's very pleasant in here. Another stinking hot day today, set to be 30 or even hotter. So I think the gazebo will be going up shortly. But today we're going to start to actually construct the pond. Pond level has been drained back down to reveal the outer shelf, so I can start to dry lay some of the stone. Dave's just going around giving it all a rinse, making sure that the stone is free of any dust and debris and clay and dirt and bits and pieces. But I think really he just wants to have a play with the water because it's nice and hot. So yeah, hopefully today it's going to start to take shape. Filtration system's in. So this is the new generation updated Awaza Filter Clear. This is the 31,000, which has now got an integrated 60 watt UV, an upgrade on the 55 watt for the old 30,000. They've changed the mechanism so that when you come to change the lamp, it's a quick release system and the quartz sleeve stays behind. That's great, but of course you still have to get the quartz sleeve out to clean it. But I've had a play with this, and removal of the quartz sleeve is really easy, so that's fantastic as well. They've changed the cleaning mechanism slightly, so rather than the old Revolution where you had different positions to stop and clean, you've gone back to the original generation Filter Clear where you've just got a backwash and a filter. And they've changed the locking collar as well. A lot of people used to struggle with this. I didn't think that the old one had any issues, but this one I think is a little bit easier. We've routed all of the pipe work, the ins and the outs, underneath the decking here, so that's all concealed, and that worked out as a very handy conduit. There's going to be a length of pipe positioned from the pond here where the pump is going to sit, and that pipe will disappear below ground level through the decking to the filtration system, and then return at the top of the cascade, or stream, I should call it a stream, flowing back into the pond. And I'll also include, as I often do, a little Y valve so that we can bypass the stream and just have water entering back into the pond if needs be, so that we can switch that off but keep the life support running. Well, this is today's efforts in laying some of the rock work for the pond. I'm pretty pleased with that. That's not a bad area to cover for today. Now obviously this is going to be foamed into place, so a lot of the stonework will remain in place, and I'll be squirting foam up in amongst all the joints, and then some of these smaller top stones will get lifted off. A big dollop of foam put down and the rock put down on top of that just to sort of bond it into place. But they'll be fixed nicely. Some of these rocks were a little bit on the heavy side, particularly in today's sunshine. But I'm pleased with progress. Oh, let's cool off in here a little bit. It's been a really, really hot day. It's a Friday afternoon. It's approaching 4 o'clock. I think we're going to head off. I'd like to say I'm going to spend the evening sat in front of the barbecue with a nice cold beer. But my son's got a football presentation that I'm going to have to attend to. Shirt and tie do as well, which is not going to be great in this weather. Never mind. Oh, well, the benefit of doing this dry stone, obviously fixing it later on, but the benefit of laying this dry at the moment means that all the water we've taken out of the pond to get down to this shelf, I can put back in for today, so we can start to get an idea of what it looks like with water lapping up to pretty much the final levels. It means I'm not going to leave any reservoirs on the grass over the weekend, and then we can empty it back out and resume our building next week. Well, it's another beautiful day again today, another sunny day, another ton of rock picked up, ready to get jet washed off and cleaned off. So I'm on my own today. I had a dentist appointment first thing this morning, first time for a very long time. So I shall carry on today on my own, and Dave will come back tomorrow. Just draining the level of the pond back down again so that I can continue working. I've got one of my handy blue Bowsers hidden behind the scenes and some bushes over here so that I don't end up leaving any rings on the grass. And these things are fantastic for sort of emergency filling. A very, very convenient way of holding water that can remain concealed in the bushes. I've been busy the last couple of days ferreting around, picking up the last few bits and pieces of stock that I need to complete the build. Various things like the Awaza Tridux tank connector, which is going to be a through liner connector for the overflow for the pond. A Y valve, again, Awaza Y valve, very useful for me to do the bypass for the cascade so that I can switch off the cascade but continue to run the filtration system if we need to do that. Switch boxes, cabling, cable joiners, that kind of thing. So I'm pretty much up to date now with all the various fittings that I need, and it's just a case of carrying on and getting the rockwork finished. Making some good progress today. I'm pleased with how the rock is all coming together. And it's always a bit of an actual jigsaw puzzle. You're not quite sure which bit is going to fit with what, so you never really know what it's going to look like until you start to put it together. But it's all building itself up nicely. Now I'm at a quite important juncture here of the pond, and this is the transition of the main pond liner and the stream liner. So this is a really important thing for me to document and show you guys. So first and foremost, of course, it's really important to make sure that your stream or cascade liner is big enough to incorporate the entire feature. It's no good you putting the liner in now, covering the base of it with rocks, and then finding out that it's not quite enough. So very, very important that you lay this out first of all, that it's wide enough and it's long enough, and it's a lot longer than you'd expect it to be. You've got the length of the liner coming into the pond, so you've got a decent overlap. The main pond liner is coming right up over to here, so we've got a really good overlap. Water level is going to be teetering about this sort of level. And then you want to make sure that the liner is an awful lot longer than you think you need, because as you're starting to build this, particularly with the meanders and the contours, you end up folding the pond liner, pulling it up to create creases and folds, and you end up using a lot more than you would if you were just laying it out flat. So I've put the liner in place, making sure that I've got a good overlap around the sides as well. Once I've put the stonework in place, and only when I've tested and run it will I then start to think about trimming the liner. But that's really important that you get this in now and not later. Right, well, before I get too carried away with doing all of the edging stonework, I need to get the overflow system put in. Whilst there's a nice big flexible section of pond liner, it makes it an awful lot easier for me to manipulate and move this around to fit the adapter. So conveniently, there was the original piece of leaky pipe or drainage pipe that was running through the pond. We've removed a section of that, and the end that's beside the pond over here, this is going to be a very convenient way for me then to channel and overflow water from the pond to divert it through the overflow and off down the bottom of the garden. So I'm using an Awaza Tradux tank connector. One of these are fantastic through liner tank connectors so that you can have transitions for flexible hose or for cable glands and conduits. And this is going to involve cutting a hole in the pond liner and then gluing this union through the pond liner. I'm then going to be able to fix a 90-degree joint which can articulate, and with a leaf guard on the end of it. You see I'm really well prepared here. Where's my leaf guard? Here it is. It's going to fit in the end of this. This is going to act as a really good overflow for the pond and will allow us, if needs be, to drop or raise the level of the pond by articulating this joint. So I'm going to cut a hole in the pond liner, get my sealant out, glue this into position. It doesn't matter if this joint ends up being a little bit lower than I need, because I can always extend this joint by putting a little bit of rigid pipe in there if needs be. So this could be down at the bottom of the pond and you could end up with a much longer overflow. If you have it too high, however, that's not going to work. So if you're not sure, err on the side of caution and go a little bit lower than you need. Now obviously what's going to dictate the ultimate level of the pond isn't just the angle of this joint, but it's making sure that whatever it's flowing into behind the pond liner is also suitably lower than water level. And again, in this instance, this drainage pipe is significantly lower than maximum water level. So that's not going to impede the flow and that's going to disappear down there nicely. So I've cut my hole in the pond liner. That's always a little bit of a thought process. And I simply pushed the aperture of this up against the pond liner, gave it a couple of twists, and that left a nice little indentation in the pond liner. And then I've just punched a hole right through the center of that and then cut some little sort of wedge marks, little spokes, and then removed those final pieces, which looks like this, just to try and create this hole. Now it doesn't have to be perfect. On the fitting, you've got a very generous backing plate here, so if your hole tends not to be perfectly circular or a little bit bigger than you need, you've still got a good tolerance, a good margin for error on that. So this union would then push through the hole of the pond liner, and you can see here, that's the size of the backing plate, so you can really be a little bit slapdash on that cutting and still be absolutely fine. And then this will clamp down on top of that. Now actually this will be a watertight fit even without glue, but I like to just have a belt and braces approach, and I'll put a bit of sealant on that as well. Now before putting any sealant onto the pond liner, it's important that you prep the lining. Make sure that it's clean, grease-free, free of any sort of dry dust and debris, and I like to roughen it up with a little bit of wire wool or a wire brush. It just gives the surface of the liner a better surface for the sealant to bond to, and that needs to be done front and back. So I've done that, and the next job for me to do is to run a bead of sealant all the way around the inside of that backing plate, so that when I end up putting that seal on, well, in fact, I'll probably end up putting the sealant on top of the face of that flat seal there. So when that's pushed up against the pond liner, that sealant's going to ooze out and that's going to provide a nice join. And then on inside of the pond, again, I'm going to run a nice thick bead of sealant all the way around the inside of this locking nut, so that when that's clamped down onto the pond liner and the sealant oozes out, that's going to create a really nice seal there as well. Now, pond sealant, There's lots of sort of dedicated pond liner adhesives and sealants you can use. Something called wet water sticky stuff is one of my favourites that I use regularly. But Awaza a little while ago sent me one of these to try. So I'm going to give this a go. It's very, very similar to wet water sticky stuff. It's a black sealant. I'll give it a go and let you know my thoughts. Right, so I've got a nice thick bead of sealant on the back of that backing plate. I roughened up the backing plate with a little bit of wire wool as well, just to attach some micro scratches, just to give it a slightly better bonding surface. And I've pushed that through the pond liner and just given it a gentle press, and that's bonding and that's sticking. I won't press that too hard. I'll rely on the locking collar doing the final kind of torquing down, and that will help to get some of that sealant oozing out amongst all the cracks, creating a really, really good join. So on the inside, on the wet side, the big seal or flat washer will go. And as I say, even without glue, that on its own, clamped down, will be more than enough to make sure that that's a watertight seal. But I am going to put a bead of sealant around that as well, just for a final bit of belt and braces. And what I'll do with that one is just run a bit of a bead tight up close to the threaded section of this fitting, and then I'll put that seal onto it and clamp it down. There we go. So that's the finished article here. Now, wear gloves when you're doing this, because this stuff is very sticky and very messy. And once all that muck had started to ooze out, I just, with my finger, ran it around the outside of that on both sides of the pond liner. I'm not going to touch it now. It'll end up being sort of tacky and touch dry in half an hour or so, especially in this weather. But I've got plenty of other stonework I can do well away from this area, so I'm just going to leave it, and then later on this afternoon or perhaps tomorrow morning I'll attach the final hose fittings onto here so that I can then put the articulated joint on, and the pipework on the other side running then down through the overflow pipe. So what's going on over here then, Dave?
We're now in the position of running the cables through.
Aha. So conveniently, underneath the voids of the decking, we've been able to fit or run a length of conduit pipe so that we can run all of the pond appliances and some existing appliances that were here already discreetly underneath all of this. And that was great because it meant we didn't have to dig any trenches for the conduit, and it means it's more accessible for the future if it has to be upgraded or replaced for any reason. Now we're using a 25mm 1-inch heavy duty suction hose as the conduit, just in case there's any rodents or anything underneath the decking that might want to start chewing. That's going to provide a bit of extra protection. And through this we're going to run the flex for the submerged pond pump. We're going to have a flex for the submersible pond lighting and the transformer. There's some existing decking lighting, and then we have to extend an original existing power supply so that we can then run that cable all the way down to the new position of the switch box, which is going to be mounted on the end of the decking near that filtration system. Dave is just running through a fish tape, this very, very handy flexible wire that you can see now just poking out through the conduit. And onto that we can then just tape cables and then very easily pull them back straight through that straight run so that we can manage all of our cables nice and neatly. Good job. Oh, it's hot again. Quite nice to be standing back in the pond. So for those of you who have seen some of my videos before and my channel, you'll be familiar now with me using foam fix or rock fix, and the idea is that this is a special inert aquatic expanding foam which is designed to fill up all the voids and the joints and the cracks amongst the stonework, cure into quite a firm hard shell, and that will just fix and bond all the stonework into place. I'd class it as semi-permanent. You know, in the future, if you needed to move anything, you would be able to cut out and move and jiggle bits and pieces around. But at the same time, it creates a nice firm sort of foundation for the stonework. And big rocks like this, you can comfortably then walk around on it without any issues at all. Foam fix doesn't really work on small stones. I mean, it'll glue it and stick it together quite happily. But the reason why I'm happy to bond stonework like this rather than using mortar is because these stones are big and heavy enough as they are. As long as they're well seated and well wedged, they're not going anywhere in the first place. You could just leave this as a dry stone pond, but I just want to, again, belt and braces approach, make sure that having formed the look of something that I'm happy with, I don't want those stones to move. So I shall use some of this. Now the cans come with their own little applicator. You can just push this straw on top of the can and use it solo independently like this. These are next to useless, and it's much better to have a proper foam gun, application gun like this. You can pick these up from any sort of DIY store, about sort of 15 to 20 pounds. Simply screw in the can of expanding foam. You can control how much foam comes out from the trigger at the side, and then with the trigger just get squirting and filling up all these joints. Now this stuff expands massively, so you don't want to go too mad to begin with. I fill up the main sort of holes and voids, and then I'll come back in half an hour or so and see exactly how much it's expanded and how much more needs to be filled. Obviously a lot of this is going to end up oozing out of the cracks in the rocks, so again in about half an hour or so it's going to look quite shocking, and if you're not familiar with using this you might be shocked and think you've used far too much, but it's very easy to manipulate before it's fully cured. So after about half an hour or so, any sort of really visible bits that are protruding out from the stones can be pushed back in and concealed quite easily that way. Now I'm going to try and use this straw. It's a good idea in theory because it means I can get right in amongst all the stones, but all that happens is the straw falls off and I end up wasting my time, but I'm going to give it a go today. Now when you finish using some of this foam, it's really important that you clean out the gun. And you can get some foam gun cleaning fluid, a can of cleaning fluid that you just screw back on, squirt through. That will clean out the gun for you, and then it's important to make sure that you leave a can screwed onto the gun permanently in place so that the next time you use it, the gun still works. It's quite handy to have a bucket of little filler stones, so that as you're going, if there's any really obvious voids that have got a lot of foam, which will be visible, before it's set you can then push a stone into it and let that dry into place. I'm going to carry on with this and see you when I've finished. What a change in the weather today. Bit cooler. It's nice to put some trousers on when I wear my waders. This is never a very nice job first thing in the morning, sticking on some clammy, slightly damp waders from the day before. Oh. So yesterday, later in the afternoon, all of the stonework was foamed into place. Now normally I'd like to get a chance to sort of work that foam and push it into all the gaps when it's still soft, but it was quite late in the afternoon, didn't really have time to hang around and wait for it to cure. So this morning's job is going to be to cut off a lot of the expanding foam which is sort of, you know, ballooned up at the top of the stonework, and all the bits and pieces that are protruding through the cracks I shall cut off and kind of poke in, make it look a little bit neater. And then I can fill the pond up and see what it looks like with some water in it. So I've got a combination of a few different tools here, a chisel, a tent peg, a little flathead screwdriver, some small pointing trowels, and I'm just going to go round. Any really obviously large bits like this can just be broken away very easily. And then the remainder of it, I shall just scrape and push back into the cracks. Now, there's some areas of stone where the foam has stained the rockwork, and I'll just scratch that away. It's not normally quite as visible on the darker or the sort of brown stone that I use, but on this Purbeck, a lot of this sort of creamy stuff, it is a lot more visible, but that will discolour and soften up very quickly if I can't scratch it off. But there we go, now it comes off very easily. So that's good. This is also a really good opportunity to just check and make sure that there's no areas that have been missed. If there's some voids that look like they can be filled, I'll get the gun out again and I'll pack a bit more foam in amongst it. It's a nice easy material to work with. There you go. And when I'm chucking it back in the pond, it floats on the surface, so I can just go around and skim it all off with a net afterwards. There we go. Doesn't take long. Makes a big difference. and suddenly we're back to a more natural looking affair around the edge. I wasn't an enormous fan of the idea of using foam, years ago initially when I started to discover this, but for a lot of cases it's a very, very, very easy, convenient and a durable way of bonding stonework like this. And what I like about it is that when I'm building ponds using mortar, it's quite easy to end up using the mortar itself, not just as a way of fixing and holding the stonework together, but if you've got some big voids, rather than spending time finding the right rock to fill the gap, you end up just plugging it up with cement. So doing it like this and building it all dry stone, it forces you to make sure that you are bedding all the stonework in properly before you even then fix them together. So I think ultimately it ends up with a nicer looking finish with the stonework as well. Well, I shall work my way around, playing with all of this, making it look a little bit more presentable. See you when I've finished. So it's taken about an hour or so, but mucking about with some tools, scraping away. I've removed the vast bulk of the visible foam that was sticking out of the gaps. If you get too close, of course, you're going to see some of it, but most of that's underwater. The stuff that's above water, which is visible, I can conceal with some plants and bits of rock. But what a difference that makes. Now Dave is going round and he's doing a cursory trim of the pond liner. This section of the pond over here is the lowest, and this area we're going to leave until I fill the pond up, so we get a real idea of exactly where the water levels are staying before we start to trim the liner. But from here round, the ground is significantly higher, so we know we can safely trim all the way up to the sort of base of the top of the stonework, and immediately that makes a massive, massive difference to the appearance of the whole thing. It's always these finishing touches, concealing the man-made objects, the materials like the pond liner, the fleece, gravelling the base of the pond on the shelves to conceal all of that, when suddenly the jobs like this come together and it starts to become more of a feature. So the next job now is I want to get some water pumped back into the pond so we can actually get a proper visual idea of exactly what it looks like when it's full. That'll make sure that I can check all of the levels with the pond liner and little areas behind the stonework. If there's some little pockets that might end up pooling with water, I don't want that to come into contact with soil or grass, because that's going to end up wicking away and drawing more water out of the pond than I want. So that'll give us a good visual indication as to exactly where the water levels are going to sit. I can play around and calibrate that using the overflow, and then from there we'll drain it and we'll move on to fixing the retaining walls for the planting areas. So this is the first time we've got a chance to see the pond filled up to what will be maximum level. I had to borrow a little bit of water from the pond behind it, but that can get pumped back in again. I'm pleased with that. It's nice to see the pond holding a little bit more water, and you finally get to reveal how much stonework is going to be visible and on show. In fact, the pond is ever so slightly overfilled because the overflow is coming into play, and that's working very nicely. Now, if needs be, as I say, I can articulate this joint by undoing a Jubilee clip and spinning it around slightly to raise it up, but also because it's on a rubber joint and it's flexible, it's quite easy just to wedge a stone or something underneath that and just bring it up quite easily like this, if you really want to then sort of fine-tune that pond depth. But I don't want the water level to be any higher than that, so that's absolutely perfect. And what's nice is that looking around here, there's no visible pockets of water pooling, so once the line is cut, soil and grass can come right up to the edge of this stonework without any issues of too much water getting wicked or soaked away. Dave's just carrying on trimming back the liner, mind the cables over there, Dave.
Yep.
And we finally get to see how high the elevation of that final spill stone will be. So we've got a drop of about 8 inches or so, more than enough to create a nice sound and a nice effect. In fact, it doesn't want to be too high because it'll be very noisy, and sitting here up on the deck, you don't want to have anything a little bit obtrusive. A nice soothing sound is important. So levels have got to be dropped again. and we can start working on these retaining walls. Right, I've still got quite a lot of rock left over, and predominantly what I've got tends to be either big blocky pieces or quite large flat sections, none of which really are going to be particularly suitable for that thinner collar of retaining stone that I want for these marginal zones. It's difficult when you're doing things like this. You never end up using all of the stone you pick. When you're hand selecting stone, you might think that something is a useful shape or an interesting shape, and actually when it comes to building the project, you don't use that stone. So rather than go out and then try and buy some more rock, I'm going to start to break up some of these bigger, flatter pieces to try and create some slightly smaller usable material for this marginal zone. So I've come with my sledgehammer. I'm going to break up some of this. Eye protection essential. Always better safe than sorry. Here we go. Perfect. So this is the sort of thing that I'm trying to achieve. And that means I'll be wasting as little stone as possible.